Hello, Master Gardener newbie. This is Palm Problems Part 1. Cold hardiness. It's something, one of the most important considerations one should have in choosing palms for Central Florida, or Pasco County specifically. The rule of thumb, the palm family is tropical. Araceae used to be called palmae, if you remember back to some older botany textbooks. So we got to choose carefully those species that will survive our climate. We do get periodic frost and freezes. A lot of us forget that. As I probably have said in other modules, Americans typically have rotten memories. Here's a photograph I took in the middle 2000s right after a cold event just at the border of Pasco and Hernando County. This home happens to be just on the Hernando County side. As you can see, they had quite a few palms get hit by the cold. The small one in front is a pygmy date palm. That's probably the most cold sensitive of the palms in the picture. The other three in the picture are queen palms. If you look a little closely, you can see the petiole, the leaf stem, is still remaining green. This plant is still photosynthesizing a little bit, albeit not much, but it's better to leave these fronds on rather than pruning them off. But what do you think people want to do when they see these browned out fronds? Exactly, they start to want to prune. And as we've talked about in cold, after care of cold damaged plants, the best thing to do is to wait until after frost and freeze is passed in our county, which is usually about mid-March or by April for sure. Also, don't impulse buy these plants. I see a lot of these plants, palms, very ornamental ones, creeping back into the market after we forget that they can freeze here, and people impulse buy them, and then we'll have heartache and pain a few years later when we get another cold event. It's snowing in Florida, January 9th of 2010. This should look familiar from our cold protection module. But we're right at the cusp between freezing rain and a bit of snow. Had that rain occurred at night, it would have probably had a light dusting of snow even here in Pasco County. Luckily, the rain stopped before nightfall that day. Oh gosh, they're so pretty, some of these palms, and all of them in the picture are also cold sensitive. The lower left-hand photo are coconut palms. I would love to have a coconut palm tree in my yard. It's only going to last a while before it freezes. Maybe I can keep it in that pot for a while and cover it if I want to do that. The upper left-hand photo, these were crept into a box store painted orange, we won't say who, and they were selling these and they had them at a good deal. And people were buying these right, left, and center. These are the bottle palm. Look at the bottle palm a little more closely. You can see the brown trunk, then you can see the green leaf sheath. Can you see that just above where it meets the trunk? That's a good indicator of cold sensitive palms. So even if you don't know a whole lot about palms as to what species you're dealing with, when you see that green leaf shaft like that, you know that's going to be cold sensitive, as the heart is just right below those leaf sheaths. Another beautiful palm, and I see a lot of these creeping into the landscape, even further north of Pasco County, and they're the Bismarck palm, the upper right-hand photograph. Of course, they're stunning for their big fan shape of leaves and that silvery color. It's a stunner. But I also saw a whole bunch of them damaged in the winter of 2018, right after the freezing cold event we had that particular winter. The lower right-hand photograph are foxtail palms. Sometimes it may be called a Christmas palm as well, but it's a foxtail. Notice the trunk near the bottom in the ground, and it's brown, and all of a sudden where the red ribbons are tied, notice you can see, guess what? Those green leaf sheaths. That tells you right there that's a cold sensitive palm. Even if you can't remember its name, it's screaming to you, I'm cold sensitive. So those with the exposed leaf sheath like that, or the green leaf sheath like that, they need to be planted probably in a zone 10 or even 11. So, nutritional problems of palms. We kind of did do some of this back in the nutrition modules and fertilization modules Yes, I'm kind of repeating myself on purpose because that usually means it's quite important to you as a master gardener. Potassium deficiency. It's extremely common here in Florida. It occurs first on the oldest leaves. This is a mobile plant nutrient if you remember back to the fertilizer and nutrition modules. So what the plant will do is take it out of the lower leaves first and move it around through the sap stream or the phloem and move it up to the newest growth point or at the heart. So the newest leaves will not show the deficiency, only the lower leaves. At first it'll look like translucent yellow or orange flecks, as you can see in the photograph. That almost could be misidentified for maybe an insect or mite attack. Here's potassium deficiency very early on in this particular palm, and it may only just show up at the tips. Again, those lower leaves with a bit of yellowing, that is potassium. Again, the plant is moving it from those tips and then moving it up through the phloem to the newest leaves. And you can see most of the leaves on this plant are, in fact, pretty nice and healthy green. But what do landscapers and homeowners do frequently when they see a bit of yellowing on this? That's right, they start pruning them all off, all those yellow leaves, making it more susceptible to future and more severe deficiency of key nutrients. So here's potassium deficiency. The upper right-hand photograph is a pinnate shaped leaf, and on a palmate shaped leaf, the lower right-hand photograph, it can look a little bit different. I find it's a little harder to tell potassium deficiency on the palmate ones than it is the pinnate ones, but you can see the tips of the palmate one is starting to die back, and that will be one of the lowest leaves of the canopy. It may take many years, a couple of years, to change even after potassium supplementation. This is a big problem in my opinion because Americans, especially men, typically are very impatient. And when they don't see a change in this, they'll start adding more fertilizer and more fertilizer and more on and more on and more on. And well, I have an expression for that. Morons. Patience is a virtue. Also, the other thing that most people have a hard time accepting is don't remove these affected leaves. They are like a savings account for potassium. Removing them makes it you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. The other thing is, even with potassium fertilization or supplementation, these leaves that are affected will never turn green again. So again, it's a very frustrating thing for the homeowner to understand that correcting this may be a 2-year long process. Magnesium. What common product do we usually give palms because somebody told you to do it? Yes, Epsom salt provides magnesium, but it's certainly not the only nutrient that palms will need in their lifetime. So usually I recommend against just putting on Epsom salt. It usually causes future deficiency issues with potassium, especially. Again, this is also very common in Florida, especially on the pinnate palm leaf species. The date palms, Phoenix spus, are very susceptible. The symptoms begin on the oldest leaves. Again, magnesium is a mobile plant element. It is moved from the lowest leaves through the phloem up to the top of the plant to the heart of the plant for the new leaves to get. You can see the strong green band down the center by the midrib or the petiole, and you will see the brightly yellow outer parts of those leaflets. It's very distinct. And on a palmate shape, palm is even more striking, the upper right-hand photograph. You might even think that some kind of purposeful variegation that people are trying to maintain, but it's really a magnesium deficiency. The beauty of potassium and magnesium deficiencies are they're rarely, if ever, fatal. The best way to treat both of them, really, potassium and magnesium, is preventatively. not just with magnesium sulfate, okay? Even though it says it on the slide, I'll talk more about the specific palm fertilizer that we recommend at UF. I think this is a better way to go than trying to buy bags of potassium and magnesium and manganese and all this jazz when it's already mixed up in the proper proportion. Iron deficiency. It can happen in palms, but it's not very common. And it's not caused by pH or lack of it in the soil. It appears on usually poorly aerated soils. Those that don't drain real well would be a good example. Kind of the heavier, clayier soils that can occasionally happen in some parts of our county. I live in Brooksville with a lot of clay, so that would be high on my list of an area for that. There are also some areas that we've built that are kind of, they got that dark, almost swampy soil because, well, I'll leave it there. Also, it happens on palms that are planted too deeply. You don't want to plant them any deeper than where the roots meet the stem or stems or trunk of the particular palm species. Now, this is an immobile plant nutrient, so therefore, once it's in the plant tissue, it is locked in place. The plant won't move it from those older leaves into the newer leaves, like I mentioned with the other two nutrients. So, when the new leaves come out, they will have interveinal chlorosis. Interveinal, in between the veins of the plant. Now, if we remember back to our botany module, gee, that seems so long ago. You do remember back that far, don't you? Your memory isn't that short, is it? All right, I will remind you. What are the veins like on a monocot? You remember if you had to draw the veins on a monocot, how would you do it? The veins are parallel to one another. So what you would see in this deficiency, if we had a close-up shot, is one yellow, a stripe of yellow, a stripe of green, a stripe of yellow, a stripe of green, a stripe of yellow, a stripe of green. Kind of like pattern on a zebra, so to speak. Frizzle top. This is a fatal nutrient deficiency of palms if it's not corrected in time. It's a deficiency of manganese. Now, what element is provided by Epsom salt? That's magnesium. This is a whole different element, manganese. It affects the newest foliage first. Again, it's immobile in the plant. And the way palms and the lower picture cycad, sago, parenthetically palm, they have similar nutrient deficiency symptoms and fertilizer requirements, so I'm going to start lumping them together for the remainder of the nutrition parts of this module. But the newest leaves of both the palm in the upper right hand photograph and of the sago, parenthetically palm, you can see are showing severe deficiency of manganese. The newest leaves come out withered, like in the palm, or frizzled in the palm, or they come out all brown in some cases of the sago. This will need to be corrected by the next growing season, or the plant, when it tries to flush out new leaves, probably won't flush out any if it's that severely deficient in the soil. And eventually the lower leaves of both the palm and the sago will die out, and then the plant will starve to death. Not necessarily the best picture, but you can also sometimes see that the spear leaves of some of these palm species, those are the newest leaves in the middle there. There's one, two, three, four. You can see that failed to unfurl. They may just remain spear-shaped. Again, this is best corrected by applying the nutrients to the soil, not foliarly. That's easy for someone to say, huh? Again, we see this on a lot of the phoenix, we see this on the sagos, and we'll see it on the queen palms. But again, trying to piecemeal manganese, magnesium, and potassium and get them in the right proportion and balance to one another generally is very difficult for the homeowner to do correctly. Boron deficiency. Boron is a micronutrient. Usually boron deficiencies are caused by boron being leached out of the root zone. Usually this is due to excessive or high rainfall or irrigation exacerbating the problem. The last few summers we've had very wet, rainy seasons. I just recently heard we had about 20 inches in the last month in 2018. So that leaches them out. Well, if the leaves are forming, it may not have the boron at the time they're formed. Now, you may not see that deficiency symptom showing up for months because the leaves don't immediately come out deficient even with 20 inches of rain in a month. It may be a few months from now when that leaf comes out in, let's say, October or November for that matter. So some people have a really hard time correlating the heavy rains of summer with boron deficiency and showing up in the fall or the winter, even for that matter the next year. Uh, what was I going to say? Boron will stop leaching once we get back to more normal rainfall and we're not excessively irrigating. Now I want to make this painfully clear. Boron deficiency, correcting it is extremely tricky and potentially deadly. Yes, you can kill plants with too much. The moron approach, if you remember. So, boron is a micronutrient. The plant needs it in extremely small amounts. But even though it's a micronutrient doesn't mean it's not very important to the palm. Again, the newest leaves are being affected. You can kind of see in the photograph here. Let's look at that a minute. I really haven't talked about that photo. Can you see how there's 3 spear leaves that are just trying to open but not doing really such a great job? The one in the middle almost looks like it's starting to turn brown. Again, much like manganese deficiency, this will be a fatal micronutrient deficiency if it's not corrected in time. But a little bit of boron will help. A little bit too much will work more like glyphosate. Well, no, not exactly like glyphosate, but like a herbicide. You can kill plants with too much boron. Some other odd symptomology that I don't generally see too often, but we have photographs from UF, so I'll put them in here, is this hook leaf, as they call it. I kind of think of it as Zeeves. It looks like Zeeves to me in my head. I don't know. That's how I remember it. It's an early and mild symptom of boron deficiency. Personally, I probably wouldn't try to correct this at this stage of the game, knowing that boron deficiencies are temporary most of the time. Here again is that same photograph that was in the last slide. I guess that's why I decided not to talk about it as much as I am going to here. But again, we have multiple unopened spear leaves. Those are the newest leaves. We call them spear leaves. And if that happens time and time again, eventually those lower leaves will die out and no new leaves will be produced and the plant will starve to death for lack of photosynthesis. I have seen this one come into our office and our plant clinics. I've seen it in the field as well. You get these small crumpled new leaves. It almost looks like an accordion or a fan fold, like you did to make a paper fan as a kid. And these leaves are trying to expand and simply can't. They're not fully formed properly because of the lack of boron in the plant tissue. Again, you can see this palm doesn't have too many old leaves to photosynthesize with. Now those new little leaves will do some photosynthesis, but again, it won't be enough to support a large plant for any long period of time. I have not quite seen this symptomology, these blunt angular leaf tips. Um, Again, may affect different parts of the state or different species of palms. I just haven't seen it in Central Florida myself. Uh, Here's kind of the point the second one's trying to make. Again, the deficiency occurred for maybe 5 months prior to this leaf showing this symptom because of the leaching of the boron during the rainy season or excessive irrigation and or. Let me go back a second. When I do recommend boron treatments. We have a fact sheet that talks about it. You can find that. You can go onto your favorite search engine and go to nutritional deficiencies of palms and put UF or EDIS, EDIS, in the query or after the string that you put into your search engine. And it talks about boron supplementation. I generally recommend people use plain old mule 20 mule team borax, the stuff you get in the laundry section of your grocery store. That provides boron. It's a fairly cheap form of boron, but it's an extremely good one, and plus it's relatively low in boron versus some of the other products that people can choose to purchase, which have quite a bit more boron, but because of the higher concentration, the margin for safety is a lot narrower. So before they proceed, they should read the fact sheet. It tells you to mix so much. I don't have that in my head. I go back to the fact sheet. It's like an ounce or two at most of the borax into 5 or 10 gallons of water and put it around the plant. I usually recommend they water it in above and beyond that and then wait 6 months to a year before they even reevaluate the palm for correcting the deficiency. They may have to reapply 6 months to a year out. Why would I wait as long as a year? Because sometimes it takes a while for the plant to assimilate it and for new leaves to form, especially if you're putting it out in the fall or winter months when our palms typically don't put out a lot of new growth. All right, proper cultural care. Here's where I'm going to spend a little bit of time on fertilization. Rather than piecemealing the NPK, manganese, magnesium, boron, etc., this is what I would recommend most people do when they have palms, even if they show deficiencies. The boron may be, like I mentioned, the borax, if I notice it's very severe. But here you can see it's an 8 to 12 fertilizer. 8 is the amount of what what element? Nitrogen. 2, potassium. And what did I say? Did I just say potassium? I meant phosphorus. The 2 is phosphorus. Hey, I'm not perfect. And the 12 is potassium, also known as potash. That's correct. All right, good job. So 8 to 12 plus, you'll see on the left-hand side in my font, the 4 is a magnesium, and then 2% iron and 2% manganese. And they'll also have other micronutrients. You can kind of see on the right-hand side on this particular brand of, it's Helen, a chemical company. But you can see they also have a small amount of boron in there as well as some iron and some other micronutrients. So this is probably the best way to fertilize palms when they're deficient, is to buy this fertilizer. This is not a fertilizer found at the orange, blue, or orange box store, the blue box store, the pink box store, red box store, or any of those chain marts, generally speaking. This is a specialty product. It's usually has to be found at places that specialize in horticultural supplies. We can talk more about that if we need to at some other time. But the point I'm trying to make is just because a fertilizer is labeled Palm Special doesn't mean it's our recommended formulation. This formulation is very interesting. Everything is inside of a prill or a coating. It's 100% slow release product. So you probably remember back to fertilizer, those coatings cost some extra money. This particular fertilizer is roughly a couple of dollars a pound. So a 20-pound bag will sell for about $40. You go to orange box store that you like and you find a 20-pound bag of some other non-UF recommended formulation for palms, you could probably get it for $5 or something cheap. Cheap doesn't mean that it's good. So this is the important fertilizer to use if palms are very important. But we also remember back to our various modules, botany and fertilizer specifically, that plant roots don't just stop at the drip line of the plant. So the roots of your palm tree, parenthetically speaking, are 2 to 3 times the diameter of the top. Now some of our palms are quite large, especially the Phoenix spuzz, the date palm species. So sometimes the best thing to do is quit fertilizing the turf with turfgrass fertilizer and use this palm special instead. Typically speaking, we see deficient palms when they are in highly managed or heavily fertilized turf grasses. Why do you think that might be? It's usually the nitrogen is very high that we give to turfgrass for dark green growth. But that upsets the balance of potassium, manganese, magnesium in the plant. This formulation helps to rebalance that out, and if it's used in the turf will be fine. Again, it's kind of an expensive turfgrass fertilizer, but it really is a good fertilizer. We want to use that 4 times during the year, during our growing season. Do you remember when our growing season typically is? About mid-March to about mid-October, and then 2 others in between. Let's talk about some pests that we do see and get on some of our palms. It can be different species of palms. I'll see this on some of the fan palms, usually more of the pinnate shaped leaf ones, not the palmate shaped ones. And people come in and they'll see, look at that lower right hand photograph, they'll see the brown kind of sawdust like material, and they'll see kind of almost like that window pane effect going on, and it'll be in different parts of the leaves, as you can see in the palmate shaped leaf in the upper left hand corner. And usually, by and large, by the time people bring this in, the little thing that's been eating on it, which is in the lower right or left hand photograph, is a little caterpillar. And if you've been eating green vegetation for all your life, what color do you think they're going to be? Usually they're pretty close in color to the surrounding plant tissue, green. And trust me, it isn't always easy being green. But that's another story for another time. How did they get there? Well, as an adult, this caterpillar is a moth, and she will fly around after mating and will lay her eggs onto a palm of some sort for her offspring to eat. Isn't that wonderful, Mother? Of course, as human beings, we don't particularly like the aesthetics of it, but usually this is an aesthetic issue. As I mentioned earlier, by the time people bring this in, usually that little caterpillar has become a moth and flown the coop. Occasionally, I'll take a leaf like the lower right-hand photograph, and you can see that sawdust-like material, and I'll pull it apart. And occasionally, I'll see a little green caterpillar. Now, if it's a 40-foot palm tree, you're not going to get spray up to the top. If it's a younger palm, maybe I would treat with something like BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, a biorationale, or an organic pesticide that specifically targets caterpillars. It's a gentler alternative to more toxic products. Now you're probably wondering what all that brown little bits are that I've been referring to. I like to call that caterpillar exhaust. In other words, that's frass. This is one of these we get every so often. I have a palm and all of a sudden the thing just snapped off at the top. Usually this occurs on plants that are highly stressed, very old, or are newly planted. Again, newly planted usually means highly stressed. But think of some of the other stresses that our palms might endure. Heavy rains in some cases could be, but most of our palms can generally do okay with heavy rain, so that's usually not it. So going back to the early part of this module, what I say was one of the big enemies and one thing we should really be careful of and mindful of in choosing palms. Cold. So a lot of times we'll see this after some cold events have happened, heavy frosts and freezes, especially on those that are really not a zone 9A, 9B palm. Those that are better in the 10 area. Well, then they get stressed and then the weevil, palmetto weevil, will hone in on it. It's a very large weevil. As an adult, you can see that's in the metric, so 2.5 centimeters is roughly an inch. So these are roughly over an inch to about an inch and a half, almost 2 inches in some cases in size. It is a weevil, so it has complete metamorphosis. So as an immature, it's a grub. The grub, like part of its life cycle, will eat at the heart, and thus it'll damage it. And then at some point this will start to snap off because it's been eaten up. Here we have somebody that's gone up there to the heart of the palm. It's delicious to eat cabbage palm, let me tell you, just as an aside note. But the palmetto weevil also feel that way as well, and that's their food source. And look how big in relation to the person's gloved thumb this grub is. It's about the size of your thumb almost. And you can see the damage it's already done with just a couple of them in there. And they will eventually cause, they'll eat the heart to the point where it cannot continue to produce new leaves. And secondary infections will a lot of times be another problem. By the time most people notice there's an issue with these palms, the end course is to remove it. People want to try to spray or do something, but it's pretty much like taking a cabbage, shooting a shotgun at it, and then trying to put it back together and have it grow. Does that get the point across? Occasionally we get scale insects, but notice this is on uh, sagos, or in this case king sago, a cycad, but we're treating them kind of here in this module similarly. We won't get this scale on anything but sago palms, and not all sagos or not all cycads will get it either. But our king sagos are extremely susceptible to an invasive insect called Asian cycad scale. Asian cycad scale was first noticed down in South Florida in the middle 90s and has rapidly moved further north to wherever we grow king sago or certain other species of sago palms. It has effectively wiped out a lot of the king sago palms in central Florida. In the upper left-hand picture, you can see this plant almost looks like it's been flocked with one of those cans of snow flocking material. I can assure you that is not snow flocking material or even snow on that. That is tens of thousands, if not probably a million maybe, Asian cycad scale sucking the living life juices out of that poor king sago. What surprises me about homeowners are that they just don't notice these even obvious insect infestations. They'll come in and say, it just happened overnight. I can tell you that did not happen overnight. That happened over the course of several months to maybe even a year. And in the lower left-hand picture, you can see the Asian cycad scale. That photograph probably has, a few hundred in there. And notice they're on the top side of the leaves. As we have talked about in insect modules or in person, that most insects like to be on the underside of the leaves. Well, the good eating was on the underside of the leaves, but there's simply no room because the underside of that particular plant, the leaves are just coated with as equal in number of Asian cycad scale as the top. That's how severe this infestation can be. And you can see the damage that they'll do is in the upper right hand photograph. They'll suck all the fluids out. You notice that it does differ from nutrient deficiency symptoms because the whole canopy, and those two especially, have been affected. It's not just relegated to new leaves or old leaves. And the lower picture is similar. You can also still see that white snowflake-like appearance on the underside of that particular king sago. Eventually, if untreated, these will die. The problem with most insecticides, our Asian cycad scale will also live and feed on the root system of the plant. Typically, we recommend a systemic insecticide that can be poured around the plant, taken up by the roots, and moved throughout the plant tissue, whether it's through the xylem or phloem. I'm assuming it's a little bit of both, but it's neither here nor there. The point is, it's a systemic insecticide that will also get the Asian cycad scale that are feeding on the root system as well. It's probably the only way to treat this with any amount of success. Even after treatment, you'll need to monitor these plants for reinfestation. Just because you got it cleared up a year ago doesn't mean it can't be reattacked a year or two down the road. Other things about palms and preventing some problems, especially when planting. Notice the lower left-hand photograph, this is a proper way to support a palm. We put down burlap against the trunk as kind of a cushion against the pad, the other mechanics of the support system. So then a couple of boards are placed uh, on the pad, and those are kind of, they're like 2x4s, and then they're banded down. You can kind of see the metal band. Then the big 4x4 posts are nailed into the board that's been banded against that pad. We don't actually drive the nails directly into the tree. Why would we not want to make a deep puncture mark in the tree? Okay, aesthetics may have come to your mind, but think of yourself in getting a deep puncture wound. The chances of getting an infection are much better than just a little scratch on the surface. So again, this is to prevent diseases. Also, as a side note, climbing spikes. It is not okay to use climbing spikes to climb um, palm trees. People will tell you who are not arborists that it's okay, it's a palm, it won't hurt them. It's deep puncture wounds. How many deep puncture wounds do you want in your body and be okay with it? Oh, you said 0. I figured that. Okay. Yeah, you got it. Same with the palm. Good job. There's kind of this misnomer or assumption or myth, I guess, that you can't plant palm trees too deeply. You can plant palm trees too deeply. So, let's look at the left-hand photograph. Here you can see the root ball of this particular palm, and you can see where the trunk meets the soil line. Well, that needs to be set at the same depth or maybe even slightly above the surrounding soil in its new home. Why did I say slightly above? Well, these are big, heavy plants, so they tend to sink a little bit. Hence, planting it a little higher is not such a bad idea. But a lot of times I'll get calls, especially before we have some of the diseases of palms, about these installs along some of the boulevards into the entryway of some of our subdivisions. And usually they'll say this one's dying and that one's dying and there's something mysterious going on. This was about the early 2000s before some of these diseases. I remember this happening with a former horde agent here in Pasco County who has since passed away. Point is, they had all the heads where all the fronds meet, at the top, and they had them all uniformly at the same height going into that boulevard, into the subdivision. Do you think that guy sat there and lined them up kind of like you do for that photograph for the bridesmaid and the groomsmen for the perfect V and height and all that? And oh no, you're a little taller, you move here, you go over here when these things weigh 1,500 pounds apiece? No, of course not. You wouldn't do it either. So what do? Okay, Joe, that one's a little too high. Dig the hole deeper. So they dig the hole deeper for those, a little higher for that, and then they tell the client, well, you can't plant them too deep, it's a palm. And here you can see in the right-hand photograph. That plant is literally a shovel, almost nearly a whole shovel handle in length too deep. Well, eventually that plant's going to start to suffer and decline and die. Can that be raised up? If this were very early on in planting, sure. Been there for a few years? Probably not worth trying to go to that effort or expense, and the chances of recovery are poor. We talked about palm pruning, and it bears a repeat. Why is that? Probably that'll come back to haunt you at some point. Huh, notice I said point and I have pencil pointing. Hurricane cutting. Here, these are sable palms. So here, these have been hurricane cut for several years. And you can see the second from the left has one frond starting to ready to about snap off from all that over pruning. But notice how the top of the palm where the yellow arrow is pointing is starting to narrow right there, or just slightly below where the arrow is. And notice it's getting narrower on all of them. Well, because the plant has been over pruned for at least a few years, from what I can gather in this shot, that'll be the weakest point. Eventually, though, that's where it'll snap off during a hurricane. So hurricane pruning of palms is verboten. Let me give you some photographic proof of such a thing. Here are hurricane cut palms versus unpruned palms. This happened to be in South Florida after, I believe, I can't remember which hurricane it was in the early 2000s. But here they came through at this obviously very fancy inn, turn in, and at the turn in they hired a professional, quote, quote, company to come in and hurricane prune their palms. Probably the management of the turn in was very happy to have this done ahead of time. So they thought. And then they didn't get to finish the job before one of the hurricanes blew through. Notice the ones that were not pruned and have a full head of leaves from 9 to 3. Do we remember 9 to 3? We don't remove them above the horizontal plane. However you can remember it best. You should know that. Notice how they were unaffected. Boy, that's pretty strong proof of don't hurricane cut palms. Notice the ones that have all their fronds folded down. Those will probably eventually die because probably it's hard to tell in the photograph whether the heart is even there anymore. In some cases, I have the feeling it is not in most cases. So again, we only want to prune a palm frond when it is completely brown and from 9 to 3. Now look at the picture on the left hand side. That's what a normal date palm should look like. A big full head of leaves like that. We rarely see this in modern landscapes. I find that to be very beautiful, but other people want to manage every bit of Mother Nature. It's not nice to fool Mother Nature. Hopefully one of you got that joke out there in online world. And here we can see more typical in the upper and lower photographs over pruned or above the horizontal plane. Those poor plants will have problems in the future if it's especially repeated time and again. Sometimes we'll get calls, my palm looked good one day and all of a sudden the canopy collapsed. Well, usually that's caused by really only one thing, and that's poof, there it is, and it's gone. And sometimes you may see a burn mark going down the trunk of the palm. Other times the lightning bolt may jump across and end up hitting the turf grass, as you can see in the lower right-hand photograph. No two lightning strikes will ever look quite the same, I have found out, and just because you don't see a burn mark doesn't mean it wasn't struck by lightning. But when it looked good one day and the canopy has collapsed a couple of days later, it's a pretty good guarantee that lightning is the culprit. Let's end part one of palm problems. Join me in part two of palm problems quickly.